Good evening, and welcome back to part two of The Great Escape Shackleton's Antarctic Adventure. I'm Cindy Jordan, a member of the Board of Directors of the Walnut Creek Library Foundation, and we are so happy to have you joining our virtual Live from the Library program. I want to extend a special thanks to our live program sponsors, Friends of the Walnut Creek Library, Minuteman Press Lafayette, and East Bay Times. As we shared last evening, even though our libraries are closed, programs and activities like this one continue to thrive online and bring our community together. Now more than ever, the Foundation needs your support to continue funding the broad range of programs and free activities our libraries offer. I'll be back at the end of tonight's program to tell you how you can support our efforts. In thinking about tonight's presentation, I'm reminded of a quote attributed to Sir Raymond Priestley, an Antarctic explorer and geologist. For scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. With that, I would like to welcome back our speaker, Mark Jordan, as we continue on this journey. We will pick up where we left off last night on Elephant Island. At the end of Mark's presentation, we will have time for a Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Welcome, Mark. I'll now turn the spotlight over to you to continue Shackleton's extraordinary voyage.
Thank you, Cindy. Let me get my object on the screen here and get me to play from current slide. Come on, there we are. What happens now you will find out. If you thought yesterday's narrative was full of excitement and challenges, wait until you hear tonight's. Let me recap a little bit. Shackleton and 27 men set out to cross Antarctica. They head down towards Antarctica where their ship is caught in the ice. The ship is eventually crushed by the ice and they're stuck on an ice floe for 6 months. The ice floe finally breaks up. They get into 3 small boats and head out and through perseverance manage to end up on Elephant Island, a big rock in the middle of nowhere. There's not even a McDonald's on Elephant Island. They have to, there is no likelihood that they're going to be rescued on Elephant Island. So they have to decide to go somewhere independently. And the most likely place to go is South Georgia Island. It laid within the prevailing winds and currents, but the island was 800 miles away. There they would find a whaling station, ships and men, but locating the northern tip of that on the open Antarctic Ocean would be harder than finding a needle in a haystack. They had only a sextant, a compass, and a chronometer, but despite almost overwhelming difficulties, they decided 6 men would take the James Caird across the most treacherous seas on Earth, hoping to hit that minuscule target. So, on the morning of April 20th, Shackleton announced he would take Worsley as his navigator, Tom Crean, except for Wild, Shackleton's most experienced and reliable man, Vincent and McCarthy, 2 of the most reliable boatmen, while they transited to Elephant Island. Shackleton approached McNish. Can you make the Caird seaworthy? A pleased McNish assured Shackleton that he would do everything in his power to fix the Caird. Shackleton had never forgiven McNish the rebellion on the ice, despite all the incredible work he had done, and he never would. But he needed McNish. Any possible successful transit of the Southern Ocean depended on Shippy McNish. For the next 3 days in the blizzard that still raged, McNish modified the Caird. Ord Lees recorded, "The carpenter has contrived wonderfully with the very limited resources at hand." On April 24th, the work on the Caird was done. Here you can see the men on the photograph on the right, the men getting the Caird ready to push into the water. The photograph on the left is a replica of the James Caird, and you can see one that's not particularly large. You can see the canvas deck there, the small opening which will admit the men and the couple of masts. Here you see them again moving the Caird about ready to go into the water. Next to it is the Stancomb Wills. They'll push the Caird out, then they'll move supplies and ballast to the waiting cared in the Stancomb Wills. If you look at the lower left-hand side of the photograph, you'll see bags there, and some of those bags are rocks for ballast. There, as they were pushing her out, she rolled hard to her side, and McNish recorded, "As we were getting her off the beach, a heavy surf came up. She almost capsized. She emptied myself and Vincent overboard." Several men offered to exchange clothes with McNish and Vincent. McNish refused. Vincent exchanged trousers with Howe, nothing else. The superstitious among the men whispered that this was an omen. And here you can see the Caird working itself out to sea. 2 barrels of ice were loaded. And you see, again, here you can see, well, you can't see the Stancomb Wills here because they're blocking it. But the Stancomb Wills is right here. Out here is the Caird, and you can see the men are carrying the ballast to put in the Stancomb Wills. Now, 2 barrels of ice were loaded to be used as fresh water. One knocked into a rock as it was being towed. They loaded the food supply, 2 Primus stoves, and 6 sleeping bags. And here again, you see them doing their final loading up of the Stancomb Wills to take the material out to the boat. McNish took his tools, and as we shall see, an incredibly important carpenter's adze. Shackleton shook hands with all the men and was ferried out to the Caird. Hurley caught the departure. "We took our goodbye of our companions and set sail." McNish. Would they ever reappear? Lord Lees, watching them go, wrote, "They made surprising speed for such a small craft. We watched them until they were out of sight, which was not long, for such a tiny boat was soon lost to sight on the great heaving ocean. As she dipped into the trough of each wave, she disappeared completely, sail and all." The James Caird sailed off to undertake one of the most improbable small boat journeys ever conceived. So the men are now alone on Elephant Island. Here you see a picture of 20 of the 22 men. Hurley's taking the photo, and poor Blackborough is off in his sleeping bag somewhere, nursing his feet. They remain on Elephant Island, hoping that within 4 weeks, a rescue ship would appear. If the Caird sailed uninterruptedly for, I'd say, 4 miles an hour, a not unreasonable speed, the men in the boat would cover 800 miles in less than 10 days. A stout whaler could reach Elephant Island in a couple of days. Then, in only 2 weeks or so, rescue and safety. But while they waited this interim to pass, they would have to make themselves safe and comfortable on the inhospitable shores of Elephant Island. The men wrung out their wet clothes and sleeping bags. Green prepared a hot meal. Then everyone crawled into the bags and slept until the next morning, waking to mist and snow. After breakfast, Wilde urged proper positive attitudes. Remember, optimism. Wilde is Shackleton's alter ego here. They dug a cave into a snowbank. But as they moved further in, their body heat melted the snow, making the cave uninhabitable. And Hurley grumbled, "Life here without a hut and equipment is almost beyond endurance." And one may wonder whether Hurley was deliberately punning or not. Marston and Greenstreet suggested using the 2 boats for shelter. That would render the boats unusable, but the need for immediate shelter outweighed the possible future need of a vessel. So, plus, Sir Ernest's reappearance would obviate that need, so Wilde authorized construction of this shelter. Laboriously moving rocks from the seaward end of the spit, they built 2 4-foot-high walls 19 feet apart. And here you see another view of the spit. This is the area on which they're going to camp. It's been worn away in the century that, in the interim century there, at one time it was probably 9 or 10 feet above that watermark there, or that water line there. The 2 boats were placed upside down on the wall. And here you see the 2 boats. It's covered with the tents and some of the other material. They're hanging out stuff to dry. On the right-hand side, you can see one of the walls right over here. Inside, the men bunked on the thwarts of the boats or on cloths laid on the ground. And here is a drawing that was made of the interior of the hut. And if you look on the left-hand side, you can see where the men were sleeping on the ground. Here are sleeping bags up here, a sleeping bag on each side here. And at the end, in the middle, there was a workspace where the cook would work. Over here was the stove, ice pot, and so on. On the upper level, where the boats were, the men took lumber, laid the lumber on the thwarts, and then laid their sleeping bags on the thwarts, and that's where they would sleep. And so you get a good look at the layout of what they had. Was it comfortable? Well, it probably wasn't that comfortable, but it was probably better than any other alternative they had. Whatever comfort they did have was short-lived. A blizzard found every nook, hole, and cranny. Everything deeply snowed over, footgear frozen so stiff that we could only put it on by degrees, not a dry or warm pair of gloves amongst us. Men sat and cursed, not loudly, but with an intenseness that showed their hatred of this island on which we had sought shelter, Macklin. They stuffed the cracks with blanket strips. Hurley placed a blubber stove at one end. For a while, smoke filled the snuggery, as the men call their lodgings, until Kerr constructed a chimney using a biscuit tin, necessity being the mother of invention here. Marston and Hurley made lamps using sardine tins and blubber. They added several windows using the glass from a chronometer case and a piece of celluloid that Hurley had salvaged from his camera equipment. Wild woke Green at 7 a.m. to cook, usually seal steaks, sometimes penguin. At 9:30, Wild chased the others out with the cry, "Lash up and stow! The boss may come today," optimism. The men would roll up their bags, ready to board the rescue ship. They daily guessed when Shackleton would return. After eating, they hunted, skinned their quarry, made sure the snuggery was snug, anything necessary to ensure survival. At 12:30, they ate again, then more work. Dinner at 4:30, then the men would sit around the stove. Hurley recorded. The light thrown up by the lamps illuminates smoke-covered faces like stage footlights. The sparkling eyes and glint on the aluminum mugs, the stream of flickering light thrown out from the open stove door, making weird dancing shadows on the inside of the boats, makes me think of a council of brigands holding revelry after an escape in a chimney or coal mine. Just a second. Often, Hussey, who carried his banjo every day since abandoning the Endurance, would play, and the men would sing. They would sleep by 7. By May 15th, the beach ice over and snow blanketed the ground. The weather was warmer than on the ice floes, but they were exposed to harsh winds and were never able to get completely dry. At times, it was 11 degrees. They ate well, but the monotonous diet of meat wore on them physically and mentally. Occasionally, Wild would allow a dip into rations that had been stored for special purposes, or if the meat disappeared. Fine barley pudding for lunch, the remnants also of jam. The meal gave us great pleasure inasmuch as we have not had a full cereal meal for 2.5 months. Hurley. With winter, the men would spend up to 17 hours in their bag. Greenstreet noted, everyone spent the day rotting in their bags with blubber and tobacco smoke. So passes another goddamn rotten day. Given the close quarters, the weather, the lack of daylight, what they had passed to date, Wild remarkably had kept them reasonably harmonious. They had books, Keats, Browning, The Ancient Mariner, a penny cookbook, a couple of polar books, plus volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which they read, but they also ripped out pages to light fire and light their pipes while their tobacco lasted. Using the cookbook, they planned imaginary dinners. They spoke of food a lot. And Ordlees recorded, "We want to be overfed. Grossly overfed, yes, very grossly overfed on nothing but porridge and sugar, black currant and apple pudding and cream, cake, milks, eggs, jam, honey, and bread and butter till we burst. And we'll shoot the man who offers us meat. Rickinson had recovered from his heart attack, but Blackbarrow's toes had turned gangrenous. Doctors Macklin and McElroy set to amputate. On June 15th, Hurley stoked the stove to achieve a temperature of 80 degrees. The two doctors brought in ice and filled a hoosh pot with it, melting it until boiling to sterilize the instruments. Macklin administered the anesthetic, while McElroy cut away each of Blackbarrow's 5 toes of his left foot. One can only marvel at the operating theater, full of grease, blubber smoke, soot, reindeer hairs from their sleeping bags and boots, seal and penguin blood, meat scraps, and guano. But fortunately, Blackbarrow recovered, but with a slight limp. On June 22nd, the men put together a midwinter show. James wrote a commemorative poem. Upon an isle whose icy shores are washed by stormy seas, here dwells beneath 2 upturned boats, in comfort and in ease, a grimy crew of 22, who've drifted many a mile, and oft at night within each bag a face beams with a smile. My name is Frankie Wildo, my hut's on Elephant Isle, the walls without a single brick, the roofs without a tile, but nevertheless you must confess, for many and many a mile, it's the most palatial dwelling place you'll find on Elephant Isle. They mixed 90% methylated spirits, which were meant to preserve specimens, with sugar, water, and ginger, and they affectionately named it Gut Rot 1916. They toasted, as they always did, to our wives and sweethearts. May they never meet. Pack ice formed around the island. Rain brought sludge to the floor of the snuggery, activating the filth, particularly the penguin guano. They took turns flushing it out, eventually removing 80 gallons of what Hurley described as odorous liquid. You can imagine how awful it was. More serious, the food supply was dwindling. Without sugar, no more gut rot. Their powdered milk was gone. Packaged rations were getting perilously low. They were forced to kill more and more of the local residents. About 30 Gentoo penguins came ashore, and I am pleased the weather was too bad to slay them. We are heartily sick of being compelled to kill every bird that comes ashore. Now here, you can see a Gentoo penguin on the left. You can see Hurley's diary on the right, and if you look at the little drawing here, he's shown the men pursuing a penguin in their attempt to catch and slaughter them. On August 13th, a bright, clear day, reasonably warm, they carried out Blackbarrow, who had not been outside the snuggery, and except for the surgery outside his sleeping bag, for the entire time they had been encamped on Elephant Island. Almost 4 months had elapsed since the departure of the Caird, well beyond the time of any reasonable expectation of rescue. The passage of time was beginning to wear heavily. A ship should have made her appearance by now. The weather is wretched. The silence is extremely oppressive. Hurley. One wonders how Sir Ernest fared. The subject is practically taboo. Everyone keeps their own counsel, and it is quite obvious that no one really dare say what they really do think. Lord Lees. Wild started planning to take the Dudley Docker with 4 other men to Deception Island, which is 250 miles to the southwest. Now you look at the Dudley Docker there, and she doesn't look particularly seaworthy, and that's before she was turned into the cabin. They intended to leave in early October, hoping to intercept the whalers. Of course, the plan was one of desperation, as the Dudley Docker could never have been made as seaworthy as a James Caird. But ever hope, ever optimism. On August 30th, as the tide went out, they gathered limpets, a small mollusk which they'd use for the evening meal. Most of the men moved into the snuggery to enjoy a wonderful, delicious, highly tasteful meal of seal's backbone hoosh. Marston remained outside, shelling limpets. Then the diners heard footsteps. Not the normal sound of a walk, but a run. They thought Marston must have forgotten it was lunchtime and was hurrying down for his seal backbone broth. They were all licking their lips. Wild! Marston shouted. The men waited for him to finish the sentence he seemed so desperately trying to get out. The voyage of the James Caird. We were a tiny speck in the vast vista of the sea, Worsley. The day of departure, April 24th, would be a rare day for the 22-foot longboat and its intrepid crew. The sun shone, the water sparkled. Shackleton, Worsley, Crean, McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent wended their way around icy monsters, Shackleton standing and holding tight to the mast, while the men rowed sitting atop the Caird. Now here you see a recreation of the Caird. 6 men actually sailed this recreated boat. They named the Alexander Shackleton after Shackleton's granddaughter. And this is them embarking from from Elephant Island, and they will make it across to Elephant Island. Anyway, an open lane, not yet, a wide open lane took them to the open ocean by nightfall. Worsley aimed the Caird north by northeast. All they had to do was pursue this open sea to a spot 800 miles away. That evening, they lit the Primus stove, which Crean had to hold upright as he cooked a hoosh, while 2 men held the cooking pot, the seeds bouncing around, obviously. The stew consisted of a brick of beef protein, also known as bovril, lard, oatmeal, sugar, and salt mixed into water. They ate cramped under the canvas deck, and if you look here, this is where the canvas deck was, and this is where they would have been sitting and eating. Then afterwards, Crane, McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent crawled into sleeping bags near the bow. Here's the bow again. You can see how narrow that space is, banging their knees on the rocky ballast. Using the Southern Cross as a navigational tool, Shackleton and Worsley hoped to catch the eastern flow of the current and the prevailing winds. At dawn, Crean prepared breakfast. Seawater broke over them as they ate, running down their necks. Now, the seawater here is probably roughly 40 degrees. You can imagine how comfortable that must have been. The wind blew at gale force. The small boat rose with each roller, then fell into its trough, then rose continually every day, every night in the same pattern. Shackleton assigned 2 watches, rotating every 4 hours, himself, McNish, and Crean, and Worsley, Vincent, and McCarthy. 3 men in bags deluding themselves they were sleeping, and 3 men on deck, 1 man steering for an hour, while the other 2 were not pumping, bailing, or handling sails, were sitting in our saloon, Worsley. There was no dry place anywhere in the boat, and Shackleton recorded. Real rest had we none. On day 3, during otherwise stormy, snowy weather, Worsley got a sextant reading when the sun appeared between a patch of clouds. Worsley would kneel on a thwart, while Vincent on one side and McCarthy on the other side strained to brace him in the pitching boat. He shouted his readings to Shackleton. Worsley then consulted his log charts to calculate position. They had traveled 128 miles. When unable to take readings, Worsley used the seaman's art of dead reckoning, estimating distance traveled and position by instinct applied to experience. At night, the compass's place was not visible, so their steering took place using the wind as a guide. Twice each night, they would light a precious match to read the compass. Cold seas kept pouring into the Caird. The canvas leaked. As the bottom flooded, they pumped or bailed. Their hands would freeze holding the pump, which was made out of metal. They had to switch positions every several minutes. And just here you can see in this photograph that you see this is a replica of the Caird, and that's what the inside under the deck would have looked like. They wore gear meant for a dry Antarctic crossing, and here you can see what they had. Heavy wool underwear, woolen trousers, a thick loose sweater, a pair of light gabardine Burberry overalls, knitted woolen helmets, and Burberry outer helmets tucked in at the neck. They had nothing waterproof. They didn't need it for the continental crossing. Worsley estimated that they received a cold soaking every 3 to 4 minutes. Now, you see, with the exception of the boots here, uh, the boots are modern boots. They're not what Shackleton would have wore. Shackleton, they had reindeer hide boots, but you can see basically the clothing that they were wearing. On the left, you see an ad for Bovril. Bovril is this meat protein thing. I just want to read you a little bit of it. For the first time in the history of Antarctic exploration, Sir Ernest Shackleton will undertake an expedition where there will be no food depots for the return journey, which of course is not an accurate statement. But Bovril is the food which has been proved by independent scientific investigation to possess a bodybuilding power equal to from 10 to 20 times the amount taken. Truth in advertising, I guess. Anyway, I don't know if you've ever tasted Bovril. I'm sure it's not the most interesting thing in the world. When the wind perversely blew from the north, they tacked in place, afraid of being pushed too far into the icy danger to the south. Worsley's most important item, his navigational books, would constantly get wet when taken out for a position check. They had to be tended carefully. On the 29th, a fortunate but short break in the clouds allowed Worsley to measure the sun. They had traveled 240 miles. Now here you see in the right-hand corner, you see Worsley's log, Saturday, April 29th, and you can see all the various calculations that Worsley was making in order to determine their position. 240 miles, pretty good distance. On the 30th, a gale force wind blew from the south. The temperature dropped to near zero. Afraid of being shoved too far off course, they dropped a sea anchor, another maneuver that meant they were making little forward progress. Each time the Caird rose and dropped, the sea anchor would grab and the bow would violently jerk. And if you were sleeping in the bow, you can imagine what that was like. A sheath of ice covered the oars, sails, and deck, up to 6 inches thick in this cold environment. The Caird labored and wallowed. Each man crawled onto the deck and precariously chipped at the ice. And here you see the deck. You can see what it's like. And you look at the recreation of the Caird, and you can see how narrow it was and what a risky business it was. Once, as the boat gave a tremendous lurch, I saw Vincent slide right across the icy canvas. Fortunately, he managed to grasp the mast just as he was going overboard, Worsley. And you can imagine how lucky Vincent was, because if he had gone overboard, it would have been almost impossible to rescue him. They had to chip carefully. If they ripped the canvas, there was little likelihood that they would survive. Once ice-free, the Caird again regained seaworthiness, but their fingers had nearly frozen, their skin had chafed, and they were full of boils. Their clothes had not been changed for 7 months. Their only relief was hot food, hot drinks, and somber hope. The boat tossed interminably on the big waves under gray, threatening skies. Every surge of the sea was an enemy to be watched and circumvented. Shackleton. By the end of April, our vitality was declining, owing to the shortage of food, exposure, and the necessity of maintaining our cramped positions day and night. Shackleton. Again, it's a very, very tiny space within the confines of the Caird. The storm that had rattled them for so long abated a bit on May 3rd. The clouds thinned. The sun made an appearance. Worsley grabbed his sextant and got a perfect sighting. The Caird had traveled over 400 miles. They hung their sleeping bags to dry. The men removed some outer clothing, boots and socks, and let them dry. Having passed the halfway point, the men's confidence and success began to show. At May 5th at midnight, Shackleton relieved Worsley. Crean and McNish worked the pump. Shackleton looked behind and saw what he believed to be a white line across the horizon, a sure sign that stormy weather was clearing. He shouted the good news down below, and the men were all very happy. Then he looked back again. What he had seen was not a break in the clouds, but the crest of a rogue wave bearing directly at them. During 26 years' experience of the ocean in all its moods, I had not encountered a wave so gigantic. It was a mighty upheaval of the ocean, a thing quite apart from the big white-capped seas that had been our tireless enemies for so many days. I shouted, "For God's sake, hold on, it's got us." He estimated it was 60 feet high. It shoved the caird upwards, then broke over them. The caird rose like a cork in breaking surf. And here you see a couple of artists' recreations. The wave threw enormous quantities of water into the caird, which wobbled with the added weight. For that instant, they had no idea what would happen. The wave passed on. The caird remained upright. Crane and McNish bailed energetically, soon joined by a soaking wet Worsley, McCarthy, and Vincent, who had been below deck. 2 hours later, the caird floated comfortably. An aching, hungry Crane caught the stove while it floated. After swearing at it multiple times while unclogging it, he lit it and made some hot milk. Another miraculous escape. On May 6th, the wind abated and the sun came out. The men once again hung sleeping bags and clothes out to dry. They were now about 100 miles from South Georgia Island, if Worsley's navigation was correct. In the 13 days they had been in the caird, Worsley had been able to take four sightings. He used every skill at his command to dead reckon. Was he correct? They had hoped to reach one of the whaling stations on the east coast of South Georgia. And here you see South Georgia. Here are the whaling stations on the east coast. But Worsley was not sure of their exact relationship to their goal. If his estimate was off by only a few miles to the north, they would blow by South Georgia and they would end up disappearing in the Southern Ocean. Shackleton and Worsley agreed to aim for the west coast, separated by the east coast by an unknown, unexplored interior. So here's the west coast, and you see the rest of the island here. The west coast was a larger and hopefully safer target. Worsley gave the caird an eastward heading. They finished their first keg of water. Crean opened the second and found that it had been contaminated by salt water. The blow it had taken as they were leaving Elephant Island split a seam in slipped seawater. They could only use the water in moderation, otherwise their thirst would become unbearable. Reaching South Georgia, reaching fresh water became an imperative. Day or night, each man sat alert in the caird, searching for something that looked like land. On the morning of the 8th, floating in a fog-shrouded sea, Vincent saw kelp. One clue land might be near. They identified cormorants, another promising sign. By noon, an exuberant McCarthy pointing buoys cried out, "Land!" There, through a rift in the flying scud, our glad but salt-rimmed eyes saw a towering black crag with a lacework of snow around its flank. Worsley. And Shackleton said, "We done it." Fog and clouds lifted slowly. They saw land surrounded by mountains and a color they had trouble recognizing. Green, covering the lower elevations of South Georgia. On the other side, only 30 miles as the crow flew, there were men and ships. But the sea journey would require over 150 miles around the treacherous northern tip of South Georgia, and neither the caird nor the men had enough left to attempt what would have been another nearly impossible sea journey. Approaching within 3 miles, they saw surf crashing into rocks and reefs. Their target is King Hawkins Bay, which you can see up here, and you can see reefs, and here you can see the stone wall of mountains. They spent the night to have attempted a landing at the time would have been suicidal. Shackleton. They spent the night tacking. They would, they hoped, be able to enter King Hawkins Bay on the morrow. They held their position until well after midnight. A perverse gale arose, hurling the boat about, showering them with sleet and hail. They bailed continuously. The unpredictable sea shoved them perilously close to the rocky coast right along in here. Waves exploded 20 feet in the air. The wind increased to hurricane force, and the land disappeared in mist and spray. The storm was driving us harder than ever straight for the iron-bound coast. Worsley. They rigged the ship to tack away from land. The ocean's pounding flexed her sides. Her caulking, which was jerry-rigged with Marston's paints and penguin blood, could not withstand the constant pounding and began to leak through its strakes. Worsley controlled the boat while the other five pumped and bailed. After 3 hours, they escaped the proximity of the threatening rocks and cliffs. When the clouds parted, dead ahead, they saw the imposing Anarctic Island. I think most of us had a feeling the end was very near, so they're heading directly in towards the island. Then, almost miraculously, the wind shifted, and then slowly, 9 hours of hurricane slackened. Next morning, the sea still roiled, threatening the boat, but they could see their goal. Worsley steered them closer and closer to King Hawkins Bay. And again, there you see King Hawkins Bay and the reefs. Shackleton said its reefs look like blackened teeth. Just before reaching a gap in the reef, a wind from the bay pushed them back. 4 times they approached, but 4 times the wind forced the Caird back. Then on the 5th time, luckily the wind abated and the swell drove them through the gap into King Hawkins Bay. They came over here, as you can following the line. They found a cove over here, and Worsley pulled the Caird onto the beach by this cove. Shackleton jumped out, grabbed the painter, and tied the Caird to a rock. And here you see roughly where the cove is, and here you see the spot where they tied the Caird up. Land. Beneath their feet, 5 p.m. on May 10th, 16 days of horrific tension, 16 seemingly endless days. And here you can see the Alexander Shackleton landing in King Hawkins Bay. Get an idea what it looked like. A stream flowed nearby. They dropped to their knees and drank, and Shackleton recorded, "It was a splendid moment." Worsley had navigated against incredible odds, hitting the needle in the haystack. When his log was reviewed 70 years later, expert reviewers did not find a single error. They said that he was able to do this in the cold, damp, and cramped conditions of the Caird using rapidly disintegrating navigation books is remarkable indeed. Shackleton had managed his 5 men under the most severe circumstances imaginable. They had just completed one of the greatest, if not the greatest, small boat journeys of all times, and yet their work was not done. Crossing South Georgia Island. The whalers I knew regarded the country as inaccessible. Worsley. The men slowly entered the Caird, but were so weak they could not pull her onto the beach. Climbing into a nearby cave, they ate a hot meal, then retired to sleep. Shackleton took the first watch, holding tight to the painter. At 1 a.m., Crean replaced Shackleton. Perhaps dozing, Crean felt the painter, the rope that held the boat, ripped from his hand. He called to the others. The 6 men held fast to the painter through the night. Ominously, the bay's surges tore away the Caird's rudder. 6 fatigued men had arrived safe on land, but were far from comfortable with the battered boat that had just lost its rudder. In the morning, the ever-reliable McNish removed the deck and the strakes, lightening the boat enough that they could drag her onto the beach. They collected tussock grass to line the floor of the cave. And here you can see an image of the cave and how that was laid out. Now this shows 6 sleeping bags, but they only had 4 because they threw 2 overboard while they were making the boat journey. But this must have been just a sleeping pattern. They built a fire of driftwood and luxuriated in its warmth, which must have been wonderful for them. Then Crean and Shackleton collected 4 juvenile albatross and enjoyed the best meal they had in months. The flesh was white and succulent, and the bones, not fully formed, almost melted in our mouths. That was a memorable meal. Shackleton. And McNish, as though he had a Jewish mother, recorded, "Beats all the chicken soup I have ever tasted." They had logistical problems to solve. The now rudderless Caird could never journey around South Georgia. The whaling outposts on Stromness Bay were only about 25 miles on the other side of the island, but there was no known overland route. No man had ever penetrated a mile from the coast of South Georgia at any point. They were physically spent, worse, mentally spent. Though they would have to continue on, Shackleton allowed the men 4 days' rest. McNish, availing himself of a bit of leisure, I went on top of the hill and had a lay on the grass, and it put me in mind of old times at home, sitting on the hillside looking down at the sea. The only way to reach the island's interior was from the bay's eastern end, where there appeared to be a pass into the mountains. And here's the map again. Here you see the cave over here, and they have to get over here to get to where they want to start inland. And the only way to get there, because of the steepness of the terrain around, was to be able to take the Caird. Anyway, let me move on. There is a pass into the mountains that they perceived they saw. The only way to reach the head of the bay was by the now injured Caird. And as though fate had decided to show them a kindness, while McCarthy held the boat's line, the lost rudder floated on to the beach. The rudder, with all the broad Atlantic to sail in, and the coasts of 2 continents to search for a resting place, came bobbing back into our cove. Shackleton. McNish reattached it. On May 15th, they rowed the Caird eastward. We were a curious-looking party on that bright morning, but we were feeling happy. We even broke into song, and but for our Robinson Crusoe appearance, a casual observer might have taken us for a picnic party, because the only casual observers were seals and penguins and other birds. As they approached the northeast corner of the bay, they heard elephant seals bellowing. And there you see an elephant seal photographed by Hurley, and then an elephant seal photographed by me earlier this year. They pulled the Caird up and placed rocks under one side to raise it, creating an entrance. They named it Peggy Camp, after the Dickens character. The sacrificial elephant seal provided food and fuel for their first night at Peggotty. Weather forced the 6 men to stay in or near the shelter for 3 days, feeding well on elephant seal steaks. But expecting a full moon, Shackleton realized they could not postpone setting out. But they needed cooperative weather to take advantage of the full moon. McNish, knowing they would be traveling over snow and ice, took screws from the Caird and mounted them in the soles of the men's boots, making rudimentary crampons. At 2 a.m. on May 19th, Shackleton peered out to see a clear sky and a full moon. Time to move. Shackleton chose Worsley and Crean to accompany him. They left the sleeping bags behind. Shackleton envisioned a trip with no sleep, no matter how long it took. McNish, carrying his journal with him, followed them for several hundred yards. Shackleton wrote in it just before setting out. He left McNish in charge, and then he wrote, I trust to have you relieved in a few days. Yours faithfully, E.H. Shackleton, and McNish countersigned the page. Shackleton took 3 days' rations, which each man carried in a spare sock. They took the one filled Primus, and there you can see a model of a Primus stove. They carried matches, a hoosh pot, binoculars, 2 compasses, and 90 feet of rope. McNish surrendered his odds. Worsley carried the chronometer he had used on the Caird. Up they strode over 2,000 feet, trudging through soft snow, sinking at times up to their ankles. Far off, they saw steep mountains, impassable cliffs, and sharply descending glaciers. They aimed towards the nearest saddle, expecting to see Stromness. Fog shrouded a diaphanous moon. They roped together, Shackleton leading, Crean next, Worsley in the rear, calling out directions. As they reached the ridge, the mist opened up. Seeing what they believed was a frozen lake, they walked toward it until they realized they were walking on a glacier, and what they thought was a lake was Possession Bay. So here you see what happened. Stromness is down here. Possession Bay was over here. So they took the wrong direction. Here on the left, you see Possession Bay, and you see the ridge that they were coming over in the glacier that they were on. Oh, it's much melted by now, before they turned around. So they did turn around, retrace their steps, looking for another pass. The sun rose to a clear, fine day. The snow softened, and as they walked, they sank to their knees. At 9 a.m., they stopped. Crean melted snow on the Primus and tossed in sledging rations, the Bovril and other stuff they were carrying. They ate it scalding hot, then resumed their march. After several hours, they approached 5 spikes. Now, on the left, you can see a map that Worsley made of their walk, and they're coming across here to the spikes over in this particular area. They made for the southernmost gap, the nearest one, using McNish's adze to cut footholds. At the ridgeline on the slope, the eastern side was precipitous and treacherous. They could not possibly take that route down. They turned around up towards the second gap, their legs tired from so many months of inactivity, stopping every 20 minutes. The vertical wall of ice and rock frustratingly screamed no passage there. Again, they turned around toward the third gap, each path steep, each one steeper. At the crest of the third gap, estimated at 5,000 feet, they were utterly exhausted. But no, equally treacherous. Back down the 3 men went, then up, until they reached the fourth gap. Fog crept up the wall behind them, about to envelop them, a dangerous situation. They looked down a long, precipitous slope in front of them. Shackleton turned to Worsley and Crean. "I don't like our position at all. We've got to take a risk. Are you game?" The men agreed. Slowly, they stepped down the slope, Shackleton cutting toe holes with the adze. Stopping would mean almost certain death. It was too slow. Shackleton looked at Worsley, looked at Crean. Would they be willing to slide down the slope? Worsley and Crean nodded. They twisted the rope into 3 coils. Each man sat on a coil. Shackleton in front, Worsley behind him with his legs around Shackleton, Crean behind Worsley with his legs around Worsley. They pushed off, and down the slope they flew. I yelled with excitement and found that Shackleton and Crean were yelling too, like 3 children on a toboggan ride. In 3 minutes, they had descended 1,500 feet. They then marched across the interior. Using the compass and their basic knowledge of the outline of the island, ascending a snowfield, running in the expected direction of Stromness, and you can see the snowfield over here on the map. At 2 a.m., they thought they saw familiar landmarks. Then they realized they were descending a glacier, and they knew there were no glaciers feeding into Stromness Bay. Error again forced them back. They reached a ridge at dawn, standing at the base of some of the island's icy peaks. Exhausted, Crean and Worsley fell down in the snow, embracing each other for warmth, and almost immediately fell asleep. But not Shackleton. He knew that sleep meant certain death. He let them sleep for 5 minutes, then woke them. He told them they had been sleeping for half an hour. He pulled them up and urged them on. As they moved forward, they became more certain they were in familiar terrain. They approached a ridge and looked down upon Fortuna Bay. Crean cranked up the stove and cooked a meal while Shackleton went up a ridgeline. And here in the foreground, you can see Fortuna Bay, but Shackleton is way back here, this ridgeline way back here, not up in the front ridgeline. Anyway, he goes up to the ridgeline and he thought he heard a familiar sound. He knew roughly what time it was, 6:30 a.m. He rushed to tell Worsley and Crean. If he was right, they would hear the same sound at 7. They sat around the stove, eating slowly, warming their hands on their cups, while the hands of Worsley's chronometer crept interminably towards 7. Then, as the second hand swept past the 60-second mark, each man heard a sound. A steam whistle. The call of the whalers to work, it could only have come from Stromness. They were within 10 miles of their goal. They set off down a slope. Shackleton laboriously cut footholds with the adze, but then sat down and kicked footholds with his boots, Worsley holding the rope as the boss descended, each man following. 3 hours later, they stood at the shore of Fortuna Bay. And here is Fortuna Bay, if my mouse would show up. Here again, my cursor. So they stood at the shores of Fortuna Bay. So here's Fortuna Bay. Just to show you one thing, this whole area was glaciated back in 1900s, and the glaciers ran up to there and up there. They're all gone now. Anyway, they traversed the western extent of the bay, and then started up the rise, this area here, which would take them up and over the snowy and icy saddle to Stromness. They strode across a plateau, Crean leading. Suddenly, he broke the ice on a frozen lake. Crean was soaked to the waist, but he followed Shackleton and Worsley until on solid ground. They hoped that the looming horizon would be the last one they have to face, and that's looking behind them. Then, reaching the high point of the pass, they saw it. A whaling boat, a sailing ship, men walking about the wharf. Once again, it appeared that they had conquered the impossible, the first persons ever to cross South Georgia Island. They followed a stream, which suddenly turned into a 25-foot waterfall. They tied their rope to a rock. First, Crean descended, taking the rope through the waterfall. Then Shackleton through the waterfall. Then Worsley, with what little strength they had left. Shackleton recorded, "We had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had suffered, starved, and triumphed, groveled down, yet grasped at glory." They had less than 2 miles to walk over this totally flat terrain. They came down from up in here and walked across this area here. To men, that would allow Shackleton to board a ship and return to Elephant Island for the rescue he had been dreaming about since April 24th. It's now May 21st. A rescue, he believed, within a week or less. Within the hour, the three men who had just hiked for 36 uninterrupted hours, and here you can see the map, and the mileage was much more than the 25 or 30 miles that would have straight line miles, covering who knows how many miles. They stumbled into the whaling station. And there you see the Stromness whaling station. Bearded, black with grime and soot, hair down to their shoulders, clothes mangled after 1 year of wear, they frightened two boys who fled in terror. A whaler passed them, thinking they were stray drunks. Shackleton met the station foreman near the wharf. He asked to see the station manager, somebody he knew. The foreman led him to the manager's residence. "Well," the manager asked, "don't you know me?" "I know your voice. You're the mate of the Daisy." Now, if I was doing a movie of this, you could imagine the incredibly long pause before the actor says, "My name is Shackleton." Every whaler present looked at each man in stunned awe. Not having heard from or about Shackleton in almost a year and a half, everyone at the station assumed all the men were dead. The manager offered them hot baths, a shave, gave them fresh clothes, and all the cakes they could eat. Shackleton designated Worsley to guide the ship that would gather in McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent. Worsley left that evening, but only after learning that the war was not over. That evening, a violent gale swept over South Georgia. According to the Norwegians, the previous couple of days were the only interval of fine weather that winter. Their timing had been impeccable. Worsley summed up Shackleton as follows: "He was brave, the bravest man I have seen, but he was never foolhardy. When necessary, he would undertake the most dangerous things and do so fearlessly, but always he would accomplish them in a thoughtful manner and perform them in the safest way." The next morning, Worsley guided the recovery ship into King Hawkins Bay. McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent came out from under the caird. They gathered the few things they had and boarded the ship, and the caird came with them. At Stromness, the Norwegians hosted a dinner for the 6 men, the hardy seafarers heaping accolades on the voyage of the caird and the men who made it. Nothing could have made each one prouder. Shackleton arranged for passage back to England for McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent. Even in parting, despite the fact that they owed their survival to McNish, Shackleton and Worsley persisted in their animosity toward the carpenter. None would ever see the other again. McCarthy would die shortly, a victim of the war. Vincent would go down in a Navy ship, but he would survive the war. Shackleton then arranged for an English-owned ship, the Southern Sky, to rescue the crew on Elephant Island. He was on the verge of succeeding in his nearly impossible mission. But once again, our narrative is not yet over. The rescue missions. On May 23rd, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean left Stromness in the Southern Sky. They reached to within 40 miles of Elephant Island, but ran into impenetrable pack ice. Running short of coal, the Southern Sky proceeded to the Falklands. Shackleton wired England. In reply, he received, "Rejoice to hear of your safe arrival in the Falkland Islands, and trust your companions on Elephant Island may soon be rescued. George the King." But despite the King's greeting, no ships could be made available until October. Keep in mind, there's a war going on. Ultimately, Uruguay offered the Instituto de Pesca. The ship arrived at Port Stanley in the Falklands on June 10th. Shackleton, Crean, and Worsley sailed immediately. Within 3 days, they were in sight of Elephant Island, probably no more than 30 miles. But once again, they ran into impenetrable pack ice and had to return, leaving the men there. On July 12th, they left with the Chilean ship, the Emma. It came within 100 miles, but it too was turned back. At Port Stanley, Shackleton cabled the Admiralty, which sent word that no ship would be made available before September 20th. The Admiralty then added insult to injury, telling Shackleton that he would not be captaining any ship that they sent. Shackleton felt abandoned, but felt even more acutely the abandonment of his men. The Chilean government offered the Yelcho, a steel tugboat, the least likely of the boats that would have been sent out to rescue the men. On August 25th, 4 months since they departed Elephant Island, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean made one more attempt. Leaving Ushuaia, it wobbled through the Drake Passage. They neared Cape Wild through a slowly dissipating fog. Shackleton raised his binoculars. At lunchtime on August 30th, Marston, who had remained outside, shouted, "Wild!" The men in the snuggery were sure that Marston was announcing that he was joining them for lunch. "Wild!" Marston yelled again. "There's a ship!" Instantly, every man in the snuggery tumbled through the canvas opening. Hudson and Ortiz carried the crippled Blackborough outside. There she lay, barely a mile off, a very black little ship, Ortiz. Shackleton scanned the beach, counting under his breath. They are all there, every one of them. And you can imagine how relieved he was. 22 men saw Shackleton lowered into a launch. The men hoisted cheer after cheer. Several runs conveyed each man to the Elcho. Greenstreet carried the Endurance log, Hussey his banjo, Hurley his canisters, glass plates and film to ensure the immortality of the Endurance mission. 2:10, all well, at last. 2:15, full speed ahead. Worsley. As those noble peaks faded away in the mist, I could scarce repress feelings of sadness. To leave forever the land that has rained on us its bounty and been salvation. Our hut, a lone relic of our habitation, will become a center around which coveys of penguins will assemble to gaze with curiosity and deliberate its origin. Good old Elephant Isle. Hurley. The return and the aftermath. The Yelcho steamed triumphantly into Puntas Arenas on September 3rd, where it was received with a riotous welcome. But they had much on their mind. Everyone was anxious to return and join the fight. With the exception of the incapacitated Blackborough, the men returned to Buenos Aires. Then, with the exception of Bakewell, who was an American, went on to England. But Shackleton still had work to do. He needed to rescue the Ross Sea Party, the usually forgotten part of the boss's great saga. Rescue did take place, but in that saga, 3 men lost their lives. Shackleton honored most of the men of the Endurance, arranging for them to be awarded the Polar Medal. All but 4, 3 of the seamen, Stevenson and Holness, for no apparent reason, and Vincent, the bully who had to be put in his place. But Vincent had performed admirably on the boat journey to Elephant Island, and more impressively, had made the care journey. There seemed to be an element of pettiness in Shackleton's decision. But of all Shackleton's pettiness, one is completely inexplicable. He denied the polar medal to Chippy McNish. No one did more than McNish to ensure the men's survival. Shackleton probably could not have succeeded without Wild. He could not have reached South Georgia without Worsley. But here is the point. Shackleton could not even have thought of trying to reach South Georgia without McNish. None of the boats would have been able to reach Elephant Island. What then of McNish's value? Oddly, McNish almost never complained about this slight, but he resented Shackleton forever for killing his cat and talked about it until the day he died. And here you see Shackleton's grave in New Zealand. He died in September of 1930, and in his honor and memory, the New Zealand Antarctic Society erected a statue of his cat to his memory. In 1922, Shackleton returned south once more, accompanied by many of his endurance companions. They stopped at Grytviken. He boarded his ship, the Quest, on January 4th, not feeling very well. One of his endurance doctors, Macklin, attended to him. At 2:50 a.m., Shackleton had a massive heart attack and died. Hussey accompanied his body on its way back to England, but in Montevideo, Hussey received a telegram from Lady Shackleton informing him that the boss should be buried on South Georgia. On March 5th, Shackleton was buried alongside the whalers in Grytviken Cemetery. Here you can see Shackleton's grave. You can see that somewhat later, Frank Wild, his cremated remains, were buried next to Shackleton. Hussey, on the same banjo that he had carried throughout the whole expedition, played Brahms' Lullaby. Then a few months later, the men who had accompanied him on the quest, Wild, Worsley, Macklin, McElroy, the cook Green, all his endurance buddies, paid homage at his grave. What Shackleton had set out to do, cross Antarctica, would remain undone for 40 years. In 1955, Vivian Fuchs took 4 tortuous months. Fuchs had the aid of heated tracked vehicles, radios, reconnaissance planes, and dog teams. It was a crushingly difficult outing. One might ask, would Shackleton have been able to make this journey? And if not, as is likely, when would he have realized that? And what would this nonpareil leader of men have done? I'd like to show you one more slide. Here's the 50th reunion of the survivors. There's Howe, Green, the cook, Bakewell, man who pretended he was a Canadian but was really an American, who snuck Blackborough on board the boat, McElroy, the doctor who cut away Blackborough's toes, Greenstreet, the first officer, and Macklin, the man who administered the anesthetic to Blackborough. And so that brings to an end my discussion of Shackleton and the Endurance. On the screen here, you see a list of books that give you a much more detailed look at the Endurance saga than I could possibly do. And so I encourage you to read any and all of them. And the bottom book, Scott and Amundsen by Roland Humford, is also a fantastic book. So now I am supposed to disappear and give my table back to my wife.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We have a few questions here. The first one will just make you smile, from your childhood friend, Steve Kellerman. He wants to know if there were no McDonald's on Elephant Island. How about a White Castle?
Well, Steve, you're bringing back awfully fond memories and making my mouth water because I really haven't had dinner yet. Yes, and I remember with fond memory the times that we spent at White Castle up in Lynbrook. But thanks for that question, Steve. Appreciate it.
Great. So you mentioned that this was one of the most extraordinary voyages. What might be others that would compare to this sea voyage?
The only sea voyage that I think is comparable, at least that I've studied, is if you're familiar with the mutiny on the Bounty. The Bounty mutineers leave Tahiti. They then decide, Fletcher Christian and his buddies decide to dump Captain Bligh for whatever reason, and that in itself is a fascinating story. Uh, if you've seen the Clark Gable film or some of the other films, it's an interesting look at the story, not entirely accurate. But they put Bligh in a boat not much bigger than what the Caird was, roughly a 23-foot boat, and they had like 14 men crammed in the boat with very little. And that boat covered 3,000 miles. They did manage to land several times, so they managed to replenish certain things. Uh, and but they did not. But they were also chased away by natives. They landed in Australia and like New Guinea and were chased away. So Bligh manages to take this boat 3,000 miles and land in Indonesia, which itself was an amazing feat. The difference being is that those seas are nothing like the southern seas. The southern seas are these violent seas that create these huge waves, and there's also freezing cold water. Whereas what Bligh is exposed to, you're on the latitude of Australia, which is obviously a much warmer climate. But that is another incredibly fascinating journey. And if you had read the Nordhoff and Hall books, the Mutiny on the Bounty, Men Against the Sea, and Pitcairn Island, that gives you a nice overall look. But there's some really good books on the Bounty. And Carolyn Alexander, who wrote one of the endurance books, also wrote a book about the Bounty.
A related question, have there been any films made of the Endurance saga?
The first thing I would direct you to, you saw a brief look yesterday at one of the films that Hurley had made. If you go on YouTube, and I think that the name of the movie is South, you'll get an hour and a half look at the footage that Hurley had taken of the trip. There is a movie that was made by Kenneth Branagh, I think it was about 10, 12 years ago. I'm not 100% certain of the day. We looked it up one time because we saw it relatively recently. But like most Kenneth Branagh movies, it's more about Kenneth Branagh than it's about Shackleton. And they don't really give you much of the story of what happened. But I mean, Branagh loves to focus on the fact that Shackleton had a mistress, and you get to see his mistress 20 or 30 times in the movie. So yeah, it's worth seeing. It's a curiosity maybe, but it's not a particularly enlightening movie about the expedition.
Was South Georgia a British possession or Norwegian or another country?
It was occupied primarily by Norwegians. It is now, I think, a British protectorate. There was probably a dispute over it at one point in time, but the bulk of whaling was done by the Norwegians, and that was their outpost. But there was a lot of English ships that came in and out of there. So there was, the station manager spoke English, for example, and there was a lot of English interaction.
As
In
you
fact,
were,
I was going to say, Grytviken has an English post office from which we mailed a couple of postcards when we were down there.
in doing your research for this presentation and this expedition, what was the most astonishing discovery that you came across?
Well, that's hard to answer because I've been looking at Shackleton for years and years and years and years and years. I've been interested in polar exploration, both the top end and the bottom end, for 40, 50 years. And so the evolution of my interest in Shackleton was a long time coming. I think the the boat journey is unbelievable. When you read about the Rogue Wave, which he estimated at 60 feet high, and I can't possibly conceive of a 22-foot boat surviving that thing. That's amazing. But the one thing or two things I didn't realize is that Crean and Worsley fell asleep in the snow, and they would have died if Shackleton had gone to sleep. They would have all been dead. And he let him sleep for just like 5 minutes. Then he woke him up and told him it was 5 minutes. So that to me, that was extraordinary. And they must have been groggy enough, but accepted what he said. The other thing is that when they left that spot, Crean left the Primus stove there. And as far as I know, no one has gone back to look to try and find the Primus stove, which would be an incredible thing. A number of years ago, I think it was close to 20 years ago, there was a traveling exhibition on the Endurance, and it was at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And we went back to see that, and you got to see the James Caird, the real James Caird, not one of the replicas, which traveled with the exhibition. And so that was fascinating in and of itself. And the whole room was dedicated, and they had some of Hurley's films, and they also had they had an image. They had a recurring film showing what 20-foot seas look like. And if you look at it long enough, you probably would have gotten seasick from looking at it. So that in itself, being there, being able to touch it, being able to really sort of feel it was cool. The other interesting thing is actually, following the hike that Shackleton took, to me was is the reason I spent what I spent to go to Antarctica, because it was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing the exact same thing that he did. Except I saw the effects of global warming and he didn't.
Actually, Mark, there's a question here that said, did seeing Antarctica make you want to work to prevent climate change?
Well, I've always wanted to work to prevent climate change, but when you see you see it in California because of the fires and everything, but when you see what's disappeared in such a short period of time, it's stunning to realize how much glacial melt has taken place. I've been on other glaciers. I've been on glaciers in New Zealand and other places, and the glacial melt is palpable, but it's nowhere nearly as extraordinary as it is. I mean, this is a glacier that retreated 25 or 30 miles, zoom, just like that, in a very short period of time. So global warming is real, and yes, we should fight diligently the problems that are created by global warming. If Antarctica melts, most of any oceanfront area is going to be under serious water. So people in Florida, beware. San Diego too, I guess.
I will combine these next two questions. What do you think we can learn from these explorers, and are there any modern day comparison to the discipline of this group and their strength of character?
Well, there have been lots and lots and lots of expeditions. There have been lots and lots and lots of unsuccessful expeditions. We recently watched a Netflix or Prime special on the Challenger. So the space program, in many ways, is like, or was like, the Endurance. You're going into terra incognita. You don't know what's out there. You don't know what is going to happen to you. So that's parallel. By the time airplanes come around, the ability to explore unexplored territory is rendered much less significant. I would guess climbing K2 and Everest might be some sort of comparable situation. Just to note, the pictures of the crossing of South Georgia Island, if you saw, they were attributed to Peter Hillary. Peter Hillary was on our trip. He's the son of Sir Edmund Hillary, and he and I bonded, if you will, on the journey, which was really fantastic to listen to him and hear both his and his father's experiences. So I think that's comparable. What was the first question, Cindy?
What can we learn from these explorers?
Well, there's positives and negatives. Shackleton went down not nearly as well prepared as Amundsen had done. He did learn some things from Amundsen, but he didn't learn enough. Amundsen, when he went to the South Pole, studied both the Lapps and the Inuit. The British were too arrogant to study savages. What could they possibly learn from savages except the fact that the savages lived in areas like this for thousands of years and knew how to survive in it? He did take dogs, which Scott sort of did, but he didn't want to use dogs. But he didn't. They didn't know how to use the dogs. Yes, they practiced with them, but only for short distances. They wouldn't have been able to use dogs over the extended time. Amundsen used dogs. Amundsen also skied. Shackleton's men were not unprepared to ski. So preparation, intelligent preparation, is really key. You could have gotten that reading about the Scott expedition as well too. On the other hand, having a leader who devoted himself to the men's survival and did everything he possibly could, including at times incurring the men's displeasure, but doing what he think was right and think was best to ensure their survival, is a key piece. A survival, you can go so many days without water, you can go so many days without food. Ensuring that one or the other are there is a key element of survival. So, a big piece of any survival thing is learning. And I think you look at the positives and you look at the negatives and you evaluate what was good, what was bad, and you use them as your guideposts in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you. I did want to follow up on the Branagh. We learned that that came out in 2002, and also that PBS did a two-part special on the expedition that might also be worth checking out.
There is one other piece too. If you go again, I think it's on Prime. There's a three-parter called Chasing Shackleton, and I showed you a couple of stills from that of both the Alexander Shackleton, and that shows the six men trying or retracing the journey of the Caird and then the crossing of South Georgia Island. And you'll see now this was an expedition that was accompanied by a rescue boat, and you can see the difficulties they had. The guy who navigated managed to hit South Georgia Island. He was a world-class navigator. But then when they got to South Georgia Island, lots of things fell apart. And they ultimately crossed South Georgia Island, not the way Shackleton went, because Shackleton made a lot of mistakes on crossing South Georgia Island and covered a lot more time than the three guys who ended up doing it. But that's also a worthwhile video to view to get an idea of the level of difficulty that it was done, because those men tried to do it in what was contemporary garb. That was the photograph that I showed you of what the men were wearing.
Okay, great. Thank you. That wraps up our Q&A. Thank you all for those wonderful questions. And thank you, Mark, and thank you all for joining us this evening. After last night's program, we raised more than $250 from generous viewers, and I want to give a huge shout out to those donors. Thank you so much. If you've enjoyed Mark's programs these last two nights and would like to support the Library Foundation's work to bring programming like this to our libraries, please click on the link in the chat box or click on the donate button on our website at www.wclibrary.org. Every dollar counts. The matching donation is still in effect from our foundation board members, Kathy Hicks and Peter Mignani. They will match the donations we receive over the two nights up to $500. So any money you contribute will be doubled. You can also sign up on our website to receive our bi-weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date on all of the programs and activities available from our Walnut Creek libraries. Thank you again for sharing the past two evenings with us, and we hope to see you at our December program. Have a great evening.